Ayana had lived her entire life in the village of Kitembo, a place where voices were currency and silence was seen as weakness. The people there believed that the louder you spoke, the more power you held. Arguments echoed from compound to compound, and decisions were made by whoever could shout the longest without stopping. In such a world, Ayana's quiet nature was not only unusual, it was dismissed entirely. At 23 she was known as the girl who barely speaks, a title whispered with pity by some and annoyance by others. But Ayana had never been bothered by their opinions. Their noise never tempted her. She chose silence not out of fear but out of understanding, though no one else knew that yet. Ayana's silence was not emptiness. It was depth. While others filled the air with endless chatter, she was reading every gesture, every shift of the eyes, every tone hidden behind their noise. When a woman lied, Ayana could see it in the tightening of her jaw. When a man hid guilt, she saw it in the tremble of his fingertips. When children tried to deny a mischief, she saw the truth in the way they avoided her gaze. She noticed everything, even the things the villagers didn't realize they were revealing. That was her power, though no one recognized it. Most villagers assumed she was meek or timid. "Poor girl," the older women said, shaking their heads as if she carried some misfortune that had stolen her voice. The younger ones teased her in hushed giggles, calling her slow or strange. The men barely noticed her existence unless she crossed their path, and even then, they waved her off like a quiet breeze. But Ayana didn't react. She simply watched, listened, and understood. Their words were loud, but their hearts, those she heard without needing to be told. She lived with her aunt, a gentle woman who cared for her but never truly understood her either. "Ayana, you must speak more," her aunt often urged. "People will think you have nothing to say." Ayana would only smile softly. If only they knew how much she saw, how much she carried inside her quiet mind. But she had learned long ago that speaking every thought was unnecessary. Silence protected the truths she observed, truths she suspected would shake the village if ever spoken aloud. In the evenings, while others gathered around the fires telling exaggerated stories of their day, Ayana sat on the edge of the gathering, her eyes scanning the scenes before her. She watched lovers quarrel with overdramatic gestures, elders argue about land boundaries, and neighbors gossip loudly without shame. But beneath the surface she saw secrets. A stolen glance between two people who shouldn't be close, a tremor of fear in a man who claimed bravery, a mother's hidden sorrow behind a forced laugh. The village was loud, but the truth was silent, and Ayana heard the silence clearly. Even children sensed something different in her. They gathered around her without fear because they could feel her gentleness. They didn't need words from her, they liked the calmness she carried. Sometimes they told her their little secrets, trusting that she would not judge or reveal them. Ayana would simply nod, understanding them better than they understood themselves. Her life seemed small from the outside, but inside her silence lived a world rich with observation, knowledge, and instinct. And while the village overlooked her, believing she lacked presence or influence, Ayana knew a time would come when her silence would matter, when truth would need someone who could see without speaking. For now, she remained unnoticed, walking the dusty paths with quiet footsteps and thoughtful eyes, carrying a mind far more powerful than anyone dared to imagine. The day everything changed began like any other. Ayana was returning from the river with a small clay pot balanced lightly on her hip, her steps slow and steady along the familiar path. The afternoon sun sank low, casting long shadows through the trees. She often walked this way because it was quiet, one of the few places where the village's constant noise couldn't reach her. But that quiet was broken by voices she recognized, hushed and sharp, drifting from behind the old tamarind tree at the edge of the path. Curiosity made her pause. Something in those tones was wrong. Careful as a deer sensing danger, Ayana stepped closer. Through the leaves she saw 3 men, elders of the village, surrounding a young boy no older than 12. The boy knelt on the ground, trembling. The elders spoke in threatening whispers, accusing him of stealing something he'd never touched. Ayana's breath caught as she listened. They weren't seeking the truth, they were covering their own wrongdoing. She watched as one elder slipped a small, stolen object into a sack behind him, a carved ivory piece recently reported missing from the chief's home. Another elder grabbed the boy by the arm, shaking him harshly, ordering him to confess to a crime he hadn't committed. The boy cried but said nothing. Ayana felt her chest tighten. Before she could stop herself, her foot snapped a dry leaf beneath her. All 3 men stiffened. The oldest elder turned sharply and spotted her standing in the dim light. Their eyes met, hers wide with horror, his narrowing with danger. In that moment, Ayana knew she had seen something she was never meant to witness. The men exchanged glances, silent but full of threat. Ayana hurried away, her heartbeat thundering. She knew she had to tell someone. The chief. The mothers. Anyone. A child's life hung in the balance. But when she reached the village center and tried to speak, only a few words escaped before she was surrounded. The elders had moved quickly, already preparing their defense. Ayana, one of the women, scolded loudly, crossing her arms. You? Speaking accusations. Laughter bubbled among the onlookers. Another man stepped forward, sneering. This girl who says nothing suddenly wants us to believe she saw something? Ayana tried to insist, her hands shaking as she pointed toward the forest, but they dismissed every gesture. The elders arrived moments later, their faces masks of false concern. Poor child, one said, patting her shoulder as if comforting a confused girl. She imagines things. Always watching, always silent. Sometimes silence can twist the mind. Then the warning came. That same elder leaned close to her ear, his voice low and venomous. Speak again and you will regret it. That night, Ayana's aunt scolded her harshly, repeating the elder's lies. Word spread quickly. Ayana was confused, unstable, not to be believed. The boy was dragged away to be punished, and Ayana stood helpless, tears burning her eyes. She had tried to speak. But speaking had only brought danger, to her and to the innocent. Alone in her room, she trembled as she realized the truth. If she ever tried to expose what she saw, the elders would destroy her without hesitation. From that day forward she understood. Her voice put her life at risk. And the village had made one grave mistake. They silenced the wrong girl. Ayana learned quickly that silence was more powerful than she had ever imagined. After the incident, people stopped paying attention to her entirely. They dismissed her presence, spoke freely around her, and walked past her without lowering their voices. To them, she was the quiet girl who didn't talk, the one who cried easily, the one who must have imagined everything she claimed to see. But while they turned their eyes away, Ayana's eyes opened wider than ever. She became the village's shadow, always near, always unnoticed. In the market, she moved among the stalls, pretending to examine baskets or vegetables while her gaze followed the subtle exchanges others missed. A coin slipping too quickly into a greedy hand. A whispered argument between two women who pretended to be friends in daylight. A man who promised loyalty to the chief while slipping messages to the rival elders. Ayana saw every flicker of tension, every false smile, every hurried gesture people thought hidden. Children ran past her laughing, and the mothers gossiping nearby didn't pause their conversation. They spoke of alliances, grudges, debts unpaid, fear of exposure. Ayana listened silently, collecting their words like beads on a string. She learned who truly held power and who only pretended to. She learned who feared the truth and who hid behind their laughter. At night, the village quieted, but Ayana's observations sharpened even more. Moving through the shadows, she watched the elders slip away from their homes like guilty spirits. They met behind the abandoned shrine, muttering urgently beneath the moonlight. She couldn't hear everything, but she saw enough. The clenched fists, the nervous glances, the way they constantly checked over their shoulders. They were scared. Scared that their lies would crack open. Scared that someone had seen the truth. They never imagined that someone was already watching them. Ayana noticed the small things others dismissed. The chief's brother wiping dirt from his shoes only near the boy's family home, proving he had been there that night. The elder's wife hiding bruises beneath her shawl, evidence of violence no one dared ask about. A young girl slipping food into a bag and passing it secretly to her lover, even though her father forbade her from seeing him. Lovers, thieves, liars, enemies, everyone passed before Ayana's quiet gaze. Her silence became her shield and her weapon. People forgot she understood every expression, every posture, every tone of voice. They forgot she had witnessed something they tried to bury. They forgot that quiet did not mean blind. Sometimes Ayana wondered if the village even remembered she had a voice at all. She learned the way the elders manipulated the villagers, using fear to maintain their control. She learned which houses they visited at night to threaten or bribe. She saw the chief's advisor carry hidden messages to the elders, messages that shifted alliances behind closed doors. She watched arguments that later turned into public lies. And all the while she remained outwardly calm, small, forgettable, exactly what they wanted her to be. But inside, a fire of truth grew. Her eyes saw everything. Her silence hid everything. She became a living archive of secrets, a vault no one knew existed. Sometimes her aunt would tell her, "Ayana, speak up. People think you understand nothing." But Ayana only lowered her gaze and nodded slightly, letting them believe whatever made them comfortable. For the first time she understood the strength of being unseen. In silence she was free to watch. In silence she was free to learn. And with each secret she collected, she felt her power grow, quiet, patient, unstoppable. Because while the village spoke loudly, carelessly, Ayana listened. And she never forgot what she saw. There was one person in the village who did not overlook Ayana, one pair of eyes that saw through her quiet exterior as if it were glass. Old Mama Sifa, the woman many once called a seer, but whom the village now dismissed as a relic of the past. Her hut sat at the edge of the settlement, half hidden beneath an ancient baobab tree. Most avoided her, whispering that she saw too much, remembered too much. But Ayana found herself drawn to that quiet place, perhaps because Mama Sifa shared something with her, an understanding of silence. The first time Ayana came near, Mama Sifa did not even look up from the herbs she was sorting. She simply said, "Come in, child. Your silence walks louder than the rest of them combined." Ayana froze, shocked that anyone had noticed her presence, let alone understood it. Slowly she stepped into the hut, and Mama Sifa finally raised her gaze. Her eyes, cloudy with age yet sharp at their center, studied Ayana with a depth that felt almost unsettling. "I know what you carry," she murmured. "You think your silence is weakness. But I tell you, silence is power. Silence is a knife hidden in the folds of a cloth." Ayana lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond without speaking, but Mama Sifa continued as if she had spoken aloud. "They fear words because words can accuse. But silence forces people to listen to their own guilt." Day after day Ayana returned, drawn by something she could not name. Mama Sifa never pushed her to speak. Instead, she taught her through stories, old wisdom, and the subtle art of observation sharpened into insight. She explained how silence reveals the true nature of people. Those who lie grow nervous, those who fear exposure grow restless, and those who are innocent grow calm. "Silence is a mirror," she told her. "Hold it up long enough and people will show you who they really are." Sometimes, Mama Sifa would take Ayana outside and point toward the villagers passing by. "Look at their feet, their hands, the way they hold their shoulders. Speech tells you what they want you to believe. Body tells you what they fear." Ayana watched, seeing the truth in movements she once ignored. She realized the power she held, not in words but in understanding. One evening, Mama Sifa rested her hand lightly on Ayana's arm and whispered, "You witnessed something they want buried. But child, understand this, truth does not die when ignored. It grows sharper in silence." Ayana felt a chill run through her, not of fear but of recognition. Mama Sifa saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else did. "You think you are alone," the old woman added softly. "But the ones who carry truth never walk alone. The ancestors walk with them. And silence will guide you until the right moment comes." Ayana left the hut that night with a new understanding. Her silence was not a cage. It was a blade. And she now knew how to wield it. The first tremor was so small that most of the village did not notice it. Most except the ones who had something to fear. It happened on a quiet morning when Ayana moved through the paths like a shadow, her presence unseen as always. She did not need to speak or confront anyone. All she needed was to shift one thing out of place, just enough to press against someone's conscience. At the home of the man who had lied about where he'd been the night of the incident Ayana witnessed, she placed a smooth stone on his doorstep. It was not an ordinary stone but one taken from the exact spot of his wrongdoing. He saw it before stepping out, stared at it too long, and his wife later whispered to her sister that he had been restless since dawn. He said nothing, but he kept glancing over his shoulder all day, as if expecting someone to appear and accuse him. Ayana never went near him again, she didn't need to. The seed of fear had already taken root. Next, she went to the compound of the woman who had silenced her most viciously, the one who had grabbed her by the wrist and told her, "Forget what you saw, girl, or you will regret ever being born." Ayana did not speak, did not confront, did not even step through the gate. She simply carved a single line, a thin, straight mark, into the wooden fence. A mark so simple it could have been anything. But that woman froze when she saw it. She traced it with trembling fingers, recognizing it not as a line, but as a reminder. A reminder of Ayana's silence. And of what that silence carried. Ayana continued her quiet disruptions with meticulous precision. A bowl moved slightly to the left inside the chief's meeting hut, just enough for him to know someone had been there. A small, secret note containing a symbol only he would recognize from the night he threatened her. He found it under the mat where he sat, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. No one else in the village would understand its meaning, but he did. And that alone made it powerful. Every action was small. Every sign subtle. But the effect was immense. Villagers who had nothing to hide walked freely through their days, unaware of the tremors beneath their feet. But those complicit, the ones who had lied, silenced, or threatened, felt those tremors as earthquakes. They woke up sweating at night, startled by their own shadows. They whispered to each other in fear, asking whether anyone else had seen something strange. Most claimed no, but the guilty shared the same dread-filled gaze. Ayana watched them without expression, her silence sharper than accusation. She walked through the village like a ghost they could see but could not read. Every time she appeared, those burdened by guilt felt their hearts jolt. They didn't know what she knew when she would reveal it, or how she planned to strike. And because she never spoke, they could not prepare for her. More tremors followed. A piece of cloth tied around the gate of a family that had lied to protect their own. A broken pot placed on the ledge of a corrupt elder's window, not shattered, just cracked enough to symbolize the truth he tried to hide. A trail of ash leading to the back of a compound where secrets had been buried, quite literally, under the soil. No one knew who was leaving these clues. No one could prove anything. But every villager with guilt in their chest had the same suspicion lingering like smoke after a fire. Ayana. Her silence made the tremors feel supernatural, unstoppable, almost otherworldly. Even those who mocked her before now avoided her gaze, stepping aside when she passed. Her quiet presence became a force in the village, a silent storm gathering power. And though she never uttered a single word, everyone who feared her felt the same terrifying question tightening around their throats. These were only the tremors. What would the earthquake look like? Silence had always lived in the village, but never like this. Before, it was the ordinary quiet of dawn, the soft hush of evening fires dying, the peaceful stillness of children sleeping. Now it felt different, thicker, heavier, as though the air itself was holding its breath. And the villagers felt it. Especially the guilty ones. Those who had done wrong, those who believed they'd buried their secrets deep, began to sense eyes on them where no one stood. They heard footsteps that never completed their echo, sensed movements in places that should have been empty. It wasn't Ayana's doing directly. She made no threats. She confronted no one. She simply watched, and allowed them to feel seen. It started with small moments. Nandi, the trader who had taken bribes to lie about harvest weights, found footprints outside her door, tiny, delicate, unmistakably Ayana's. But Ayana had never spoken a word to her, never even looked her way more than once. Yet there the footprints were, as though Ayana had stood there for a long time, listening. Nandi didn't sleep that night. Another man, Ikan, who had stolen from the community fund, swore he saw Ayana's shadow beneath his window even though she lived across the compound. When he rushed outside to confront the figure, no one was there. The silence mocked him, stretching long and cold. Words spread quietly as fear often does. People whispered behind clay walls, their voices tense and unsure. She's watching us. She knows things. Oh. She doesn't even speak. That's why it's worse. The elders tried to calm the growing panic, but even they were unsettled. They had long underestimated Ayana, this small, quiet young woman who had grown up almost invisible among them. Now that invisibility felt more like a cloak she had mastered, one that allowed her to move between truths unnoticed. And the guilty felt trapped. Every time they tried to speak about her, their own lies tangled in their throats. Silence pressed against them like an unseen hand, forcing words to crumble before they could form. Ayana did not need to accuse them openly, her silence did the accusing for her. One night, after the moon dipped low and shadows grew long, a group of conspirators gathered in secret behind the granary. Their voices were hushed, frantic. She's too quiet, one said. She knows something, another insisted. You can see it in her eyes. What do we do? What if she tells someone? What if she already has? Fear thickened the air around them. They scanned the darkness repeatedly, certain they would see Ayana standing there, watching. But she wasn't. She was nowhere near them. Yet they still felt exposed. The truth was simple, guilt made its own ghosts. Ayana had become less of a person and more of a presence. Silent, observing, unshakable. The innocent admired her stillness, the guilty feared it. For they knew something that Ayana had learned from the old seer. Silence reveals what noise tries to hide. Over time, the entire village began carrying fear like a shadow. Conversations grew shorter, glances sharper. The marketplace fell unusually quiet. Even the children sensed something was wrong. They avoided certain houses, sensing the trembling secrets inside. And Ayana? She moved through the village with the same quiet steps as always. She didn't smile or smirk or give any sign that she knew her silence was unraveling people from the inside. She didn't need to. Truth makes its own sound, loudest in the minds of those who wish to escape it. What began as quiet tremors soon grew into unmistakable signs, threads pulling loose from a tapestry everyone once believed was flawless. Ayana hadn't spoken a single word, but her presence, her observations, and the subtle clues she left behind began forming a picture no one could ignore. A picture of a village built on buried truths. It started with a necklace. A small, beaded pendant Ayana placed on the communal bench at dawn. Harmless in appearance but not to those who recognized it. It belonged to Odissa, the woman who had sworn under oath that she wasn't at the riverside the night of the crime. Everyone had believed her. She was a respected trader with a calm voice and a confident smile. But the necklace didn't lie. Murmurs filled the morning air. Some asked gently how the pendant had gotten there. Others stared at Odissa with suspicion. She tried to laugh it off, claiming she'd simply lost it, but her voice trembled. Her fingers shook as she snatched it off the bench. Ayana walked by without stopping. She didn't look at Odissa. She didn't need to. Next came the torn piece of cloth, tucked carefully beneath the elders' meeting stool. A patterned cloth identical to the one worn by Ekon the night the community funds went missing. When the cloth was discovered, the elders exchanged uneasy glances. Ekon insisted someone was framing him. He argued loudly, but the louder he shouted, the clearer the guilt became. Noise betrayed him. Silence revealed him. Villagers who had once dismissed Ayana began noticing things they'd overlooked for years. A slip of the tongue here. A glance held too long there. Whispered conversations that didn't match innocent explanations. She had planted no lies, only truth, arranged in a way that forced others to see what had always been in front of them. Slowly, a web began to form in the minds of the villagers. Odissa's necklace. Ekon's cloth. Nandi's altered weights. The nighttime meetings near the granary. The sudden prosperity of certain families. Every secret that the powerful had believed buried now had a thread leading back to it. And every thread seemed to lead through Ayana's silent path. People began piecing together things they had ignored. Why certain voices always shouted down others, why some punishments were given without reason, why some families lived comfortably while others suffered. The truth didn't come crashing down all at once. It leaked slowly like water finding the cracks in a wall. The old seer was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. She is not revealing new truths, she said softly to the council. She is showing us what we refuse to see. The council members, once proud and unshakable, shifted uncomfortably. For years they had allowed loud voices to drown out the quiet ones. Now Ayana's silence exposed their failure to listen. Meanwhile, the guilty tried desperately to control the narrative. They accused each other. They tried to erase the signs Ayana left. They whispered plans in the dark. But every attempt only tangled them further in their own lies. Because once a web begins to unravel, the strands don't stop falling. And Ayana? She watched it all from the edges, steady, calm, unbothered. Her silence was no longer just a shield. It had become a lantern, illuminating everything the village tried to hide. The truth had been hiding in plain sight. Ayana had simply made them look. The night it happened, the sky felt heavier than usual, thick with clouds that hung low over the rooftops. The air carried the scent of rain, sharp and electric, like the world was holding its breath. Even the animals sensed something coming. Goats bleated restlessly. Dogs paced in circles. Birds hid early in their nests. Ayana stood on the edge of the village square, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes steady. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply watched, and the village trembled without her saying a word. The first crack of thunder echoed across the hills like a warning drum. Lightning illuminated the square, revealing faces etched with fear, guilt, and suspicion. For days, Ayana's subtle revelations had peeled back the village's lies one layer at a time. But tonight, the weight of every hidden truth pressed down on them all at once. It started with Odissa. She stepped forward, soaked from the gathering drizzle, clutching her necklace, the same one Ayana had placed on the bench, the same one she claimed had been lost. Her voice shook. "Who put this there?" she demanded, but her eyes darted around wildly, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. No one answered. The silence was louder than thunder. Then Ekon burst into the square, gripping the torn cloth that had exposed him. His face was red, his breathing heavy. "Someone is playing with us. Someone is trying to destroy us." The elders tried to calm him, but Ekon pushed them aside. His voice rose, desperate and cracking. "It's her. It has to be her. The silent girl, Ayana." Heads turned toward Ayana. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply met his gaze with quiet, unwavering calm. That calm was more terrifying than any accusation. The wind picked up, swirling dust around the square. A second rumble shook the sky. More villagers came out of their homes, mothers clutching their children, young men gripping torches, elders leaning on their staffs. The square filled with bodies, breaths, and questions. Nandi, the traitor known for her perfect smile, stepped forward next. Her hands trembled as she clutched her weighted scale, the one Ayana had gently tilted during her silent disruptions. "I did nothing wrong," she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. Someone in the crowd murmured, "But you benefited, didn't you?" Another added, "The signs don't lie." Accusations began flying like sparks in a storm. People confronted neighbors they had trusted for years. Long-held grievances erupted. Old wounds reopened. Hidden alliances fractured. Even family members turned on one another, terrified that their own secrets might be next. A bolt of lightning lit up the sky, illuminating the entire square in a harsh white glow. In that fleeting moment, everyone saw Ayana, still, calm, unshaken, as if she were part of the storm rather than a victim of it. The old seer stepped forward, leaning heavily on her staff. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "It is not Ayana who exposed you," she said. "It is your own conscience." The square fell silent. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the ground, washing the dust from the air. People looked at one another, soaked and trembling, realizing the weight of what they had done. Adissa dropped her necklace. Ikan fell to his knees. Nandi covered her face, sobbing quietly. Others backed away, ashamed or frightened. And through it all, Ayana stood quietly in the rain, unmoving, her silence speaking louder than any of their shouts. In the crash of thunder, in the fall of rain, in the stillness of her gaze, the village understood. The night of reckoning had come. Not through violence, not through words, but through the quiet truth they had tried for too long to hide. The rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle, washing the dust from the village paths, but the tension lingered like a heavy fog. Ayana stepped forward into the square, her feet firm on the wet stones, her posture straight, her eyes calm. Not a single sound escaped her lips. Yet the villagers felt her presence as though it were a roar crashing against their chests. For weeks, they had feared her subtle clues, her silent observations, and the quiet tremors she left behind. Now she stood at the center, unshaken and unwavering, and the weight of all their secrets pressed upon them. Their whispers faltered, their eyes darted, and their bodies stiffened under the gravity of her gaze. It was not anger she showed. It was not vengeance. It was understanding, awareness, and a calm certainty that left the guilty exposed. Every glance she cast, every subtle tilt of her head, spoke volumes. The merchants who had taken bribes felt their conscience tighten. The elders who had turned a blind eye felt the cold hand of accountability. Friends and neighbors who had betrayed trust found themselves shrinking under the intensity of what Ayana carried silently. A mother who had once punished her child unfairly to cover her own indiscretions, clutched her daughter to her chest, realizing how visible her wrongs had become. The father who had lied about the harvest yields couldn't meet his son's eyes, sensing that his deception had been silently catalogued. Even those who had thought they were clever, who had laughed at the quiet girl, could no longer find amusement or safety in their schemes. Children watched from the edges, sensing the difference. Their eyes, wide with awe, reflected a new kind of power, one not measured in shouts, not in physical strength, but in the ability to see, understand, and command without a single word. Ayana had become a living echo of truth itself. The elders, trembling, tried to regain control. They spoke in hurried tones, attempting to cast blame, to rationalize, to reassert authority. But their words faltered in the face of her stillness. Every sentence seemed hollow, meaningless. Her silence had become a force that amplified their guilt, their confusion, and their fear. It demanded recognition, comprehension, and change. Ayana raised her hand slightly, not in accusation, not in anger, but in a gesture so simple it cut deeper than any speech. Every villager understood that she held the evidence of their deeds, the weight of their lies, and the clarity of truth. No argument could undo it. No denial could erase it. Her calm presence was more persuasive than any shouting, more binding than any written law. By the time the night fully settled, the village was transformed. Conversations had slowed, accusations had been whispered, the guilty felt the unmistakable tremor of accountability in every corner. And through it all, Ayana remained silent, a constant, unwavering force. Her silence, once overlooked, had become the loudest voice in the village, a voice they could not ignore, one that demanded honesty, reflection, and courage. The villagers realized finally that words were not always necessary to be heard, and actions, presence, and calm observation could speak louder than any shout. Ayana did not need to scream. Her silence had already roared. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, the village was no longer the same. The once familiar rhythms of life, market chatter, laughter of children, clattering of tools, had shifted into something tense, uncertain, and fragile. Every corner seemed charged with anticipation. Everyone knew Ayana had seen, had observed, had remembered. Yet she had spoken not a single word, and still the reckoning was underway. The elders were first. The council, who had long wielded power through fear and suppression, shuffled nervously in their meeting hall. Their authoritative voices faltered as each subtle clue Ayana had left behind came to light. Records they thought hidden were now questioned. Missing provisions, whispered agreements, manipulated decisions, all traced back to them through her careful observation. They could not deny it. They could not obscure it. The weight of truth pressed upon them with a force that no authority could withstand. Villagers who had conspired, cheated, or betrayed faced exposure one by one. Nandi, the traitor whose scales had been subtly adjusted, felt her clientele shift as the truth emerged. Customers whispered in hushed tones, the knowledge of her dishonesty spreading quietly but unrelentingly. Ikan, who had stolen from the communal fund, found himself isolated, neighbors avoiding him, no longer willing to turn a blind eye to his misdeeds. Every action Ayana had quietly documented, every inconsistency she had noticed, came forward now without her ever needing to utter a word. Families once thought close began to fracture under the silent weight of accountability. Brothers confronted one another over past betrayals, mothers questioned the fairness of punishments they had inflicted, and children observed all of it with wide, questioning eyes. No one had to accuse Ayana. Her presence alone, her unwavering calm, revealed more than any argument could. The silence itself was accusatory, demanding attention, reflection, and remorse. Even the village's social structures trembled. Authority, once assumed to be absolute, became fragile. People realized that they had obeyed not because of wisdom or fairness, but out of fear of those who had controlled information and suppressed voices. The silence Ayana had mastered exposed the imbalance. The power they clung to was built on deception and compliance, not justice. And yet, Ayana remained at the periphery, walking among the chaos without haste, without confrontation. She watched as the guilty came forward, as confessions spilled out, as explanations turned to admissions. She didn't scold, she didn't celebrate. Her calm presence was the framework within which the village reconstructed itself. Her silence was the conduit through which truth claimed its place. The villagers learned, painfully and vividly, that actions mattered more than words, and that avoidance could never protect wrongdoing. The reckoning continued throughout the day, subtle but unyielding. Walls that had once concealed secrets seemed thinner. Conversations slowed, voices cautious, as if the very air demanded honesty. In every home, in every gathering, Ayana's silent vigilance reminded people that no lie, no manipulation, no act of cowardice could escape scrutiny. She had turned quiet observation into authority, patience into power, and her silence into a weapon that reshaped the village from the inside out. By evening, the village had begun to breathe differently. Authority was no longer unchallenged. Truth was no longer optional. People spoke with care, acted with thought, and observed with awareness. The reckoning was complete, not through yelling or punishment, but through the unspoken force of presence, intelligence, and courage embodied in Ayana. Through silence, the village had been transformed, and everyone, guilty or innocent, understood its power. In the days after the reckoning, the village moved cautiously as if testing the ground beneath its feet. Conversations that had once flowed unchecked were now measured and thoughtful. People spoke less, listened more, and observed even the smallest details in the behaviors of others. The shock of the truth, brought forth not by yelling or punishment but by Ayana's unwavering silence, had instilled a deep, lasting awareness that nothing could be hidden forever. Parents began to notice their children paying attention to subtle signs rather than relying solely on words. They saw the way little eyes watched and learned, imitating quiet observation instead of shouting to be heard. Villagers started valuing patience and careful reflection, realizing that immediate reactions and impulsive words often concealed more than they revealed. Slowly, the culture of the village shifted, from one dominated by volume and authority to one where insight, attentiveness, and integrity carried weight. Ayana's presence became both a lesson and a benchmark. Young girls, especially who had once been dismissed when quiet or thoughtful, began to find courage in her example. They learned that speaking was not the only way to assert influence, and that silence, when wielded wisely, could be powerful enough to change outcomes. Boys who had mocked the quiet now learned to watch, to consider, and to weigh their actions, understanding that every choice carried consequences, even if unspoken. The elders too adapted. They reflected on the failure of authority built on fear and speech alone, recognizing that wisdom was not in who shouted the loudest, but in who observed, understood, and acted with thoughtfulness. They began encouraging young villagers to engage in reflection, to study patterns, to value perception as much as expression. Education, once merely about memorization and repetition, grew to include observation, empathy, and insight. Ayana, for her part, did not demand attention or accolades. She moved quietly through the village, continuing her careful observation, intervening only when necessary, guiding with gentle gestures rather than forceful words. Her actions taught more than any lecture could. A misplaced tool returned to the right owner. A child gently redirected from harm. A whispered warning conveyed without fear. Every subtle act reinforced the lesson. Power could exist without noise, strength without aggression, and change without confrontation. Stories of her silent courage began circulating, first in hushed conversations and later in the open. Children recounted how she had revealed the truth without a single shout. Adults recounted how her calm presence had brought clarity to chaos. Every recounting cemented her example, inspiring respect for the quiet and observant. The village learned, collectively, that attentiveness, reflection, and the courage to act, even without words, were as valuable as any other form of influence. By the time seasons changed, the village had shifted fundamentally. The loud voices no longer dominated the spaces. Quiet intelligence was honored. Actions spoke louder than words. And in every corner, Ayana's silent lessons resonated, proof that even the quietest presence could ignite transformation, teach resilience, and inspire a generation to respect the power of seeing and understanding before speaking. Ayana walked through the village with a quiet certainty that had become almost tangible. Every step she took resonated with the weight of her observations, the depth of her understanding, and the calm authority she had earned. The once bustling square where the reckoning had erupted now felt different, charged with the subtle energy of awareness rather than the chaos of ignorance. Children followed at a respectful distance, curious eyes tracking her every move, while adults watched with a newfound respect, hesitant to speak before her, knowing that silence was as potent as speech in her presence. She did not speak, nor did she need to. Her eyes, steady and clear, carried volumes. Her posture, upright and composed, communicated confidence. Every gesture, every glance, was measured, intentional, and alive with meaning. The villagers, who had once ignored her quiet existence, now found themselves listening to the messages embedded in her very being. For years she had been dismissed, treated as insignificant, overlooked as a child and then as a young woman. Yet those who had underestimated her came to realize that her silence had been a vessel of immense power, allowing her to see what others could not, understand what others ignored, and act where others feared. The elders had tried to suppress her, the neighbors had mocked her, and the conspirators had thought themselves clever. But none had anticipated the force that patience, observation, and quiet resolve could wield. Ayana had shown the village that influence was not born of loud declarations or forceful commands. It was born of attentiveness, subtlety, and unwavering strength rooted in integrity. Her presence alone was now enough to inspire change and command attention. The square, once a place of casual gossip and public spectacle, became a classroom in its own right. Villagers began to recognize the power of observation. Children learned to watch before speaking, noticing the small actions that often held the truth. Young adults came to understand that influence did not require dominance but careful thought and reflection. Even elders, who had relied on fear and volume to maintain authority, were humbled by the realization that wisdom could manifest quietly, without fanfare, and without the need to control through intimidation. Ayana's influence extended beyond observation. She began to act in subtle ways that reinforced lessons learned. She returned misplaced items silently, ensuring fairness without argument. She guided children away from dangerous paths with nothing more than a gentle hand on a shoulder or a soft glance. She corrected injustices not with words of reprimand, but through action that made the consequences of misdeeds evident. Her interventions were so understated yet precise that they left lasting impressions, teaching responsibility and integrity more effectively than punishment ever could. Her reputation spread quickly, first through whispers, then through stories passed along market paths, through the gatherings in homes, and finally through tales shared under the stars. Each retelling honored her quiet authority and the lessons embedded in her actions. Adults recounted how she had brought a reckoning without confrontation. Children marveled at how her silent gaze had revealed truth where no one else could see it, and families embraced the subtle shifts in understanding she had fostered. Ayana's legend was not built on fear, nor on might, nor on the weight of her voice. It was built on perception, patience, and the unwavering courage to act in accordance with what was right, even when invisible to the world. People began to internalize her teachings. A father, who had once dominated his household with harsh words, learned to listen more attentively to his children. Mothers, previously marginalized, realized that their quiet contributions held immense power when observed carefully. Merchants who had cheated or acted unfairly adjusted their practices, not because they feared punishment, but because they recognized the presence of accountability, a quiet force that watched, assessed, and ensured truth. Villagers no longer relied solely on loud declarations to assert morality or influence. The silent wisdom Ayana embodied became a new standard, guiding behavior without overt coercion. Seasons passed, and Ayana's legend grew beyond the borders of the village. Travelers and distant neighbors came to witness the remarkable woman who had transformed an entire community without speaking a word. They observed how the villagers conducted themselves, thoughtful, reflective, and attentive. They listened as elders recounted how a single quiet presence had altered generations, teaching respect, honesty, and the subtle art of influence. Tales spread like a gentle wind, carrying the message that silence, far from being weakness, could be the most profound form of communication. In time, children who had grown up under her guidance became leaders themselves, embodying her lessons in observation, patience, and subtle authority. They learned that power need not shout to be felt and that the absence of words could carry more weight than 1,000 speeches. The village flourished, not through domination or fear, but through the quiet strength of those who saw, understood, and acted. Ayana's presence became a cornerstone of their culture, a living example of how courage, wisdom, and integrity could manifest without a single utterance. Ayana herself remained unchanged. She did not seek recognition, nor did she crave accolades. Her satisfaction came from the transformation she had fostered, from seeing justice and understanding blossom where ignorance and fear had once reigned. She walked among the village not as a ruler or enforcer, but as a witness and guide. Every smile of understanding, every thoughtful action, every spark of courage in the hearts of the villagers reminded her that her silent work had been more powerful than words could ever hope to achieve. By the time she reached her later years, the village was irrevocably altered. Lessons of silent observation, reflection, and quiet courage had taken root. The story of Ayana, the woman who spoke without words, was told to every child at bedtime, recounted in every market, and honored in every council meeting. Her message was simple yet profound: words are not the only way to be heard. Silence can reveal the deepest truths. Her legacy endured for generations. Even as time passed and new leaders rose, the villagers never forgot the quiet girl whose gaze, actions, and unwavering presence reshaped their world. Ayana had proven that influence does not always need a voice. Power does not always demand noise. Courage does not always announce itself. And truth, when held with patience, observation, and wisdom, can ripple outward silently, transforming hearts, minds, and entire communities. Her silence had spoken louder than words ever could, and it had changed everything. Ayana walked through the village with a quiet certainty that had become almost tangible. Every step she took resonated with the weight of her observations, the depth of her understanding, and the calm authority she had earned. The once bustling square where the reckoning had erupted now felt different, charged with the subtle energy of awareness rather than the chaos of ignorance. Children followed at a respectful distance, curious eyes tracking her every move, while adults watched with a newfound respect, hesitant to speak before her, knowing that silence was as potent as speech in her presence. She did not speak, nor did she need to. Her eyes, steady and clear, carried volumes. Her posture, upright and composed, communicated confidence. Every gesture, every glance, was measured, intentional, and alive with meaning. The villagers, who had once ignored her quiet existence, now found themselves listening to the messages embedded in her very being. For years she had been dismissed, treated as insignificant, overlooked as a child and then as a young woman. Yet those who had underestimated her came to realize that her silence had been a vessel of immense power, allowing her to see what others could not, understand what others ignored, and act where others feared. The elders had tried to suppress her, the neighbors had mocked her, and the conspirators had thought themselves clever. But none had anticipated the force that patience, observation and quiet resolve could wield. Ayana had shown the village that influence was not born of loud declarations or forceful commands. It was born of attentiveness, subtlety and unwavering strength rooted in integrity. Her presence alone was now enough to inspire change and command attention. The square, once a place of casual gossip and public spectacle, became a classroom in its own right. Villagers began to recognize the power of observation. Children learned to watch before speaking, noticing the small actions that often held the truth. Young adults came to understand that influence did not require dominance but careful thought and reflection. Even elders, who had relied on fear and volume to maintain authority, were humbled by the realization that wisdom could manifest quietly, without fanfare, and without the need to control through intimidation. Ayana's influence extended beyond observation. She began to act in subtle ways that reinforced lessons learned. She returned misplaced items silently, ensuring fairness without argument. She guided children away from dangerous paths with nothing more than a gentle hand on a shoulder or a soft glance. She corrected injustices not with words of reprimand, but through action that made the consequences of misdeeds evident. Her interventions were so understated yet precise that they left lasting impressions, teaching responsibility and integrity more effectively than punishment ever could. Her reputation spread quickly, first through whispers, then through stories passed along market paths, through the gatherings in homes, and finally through tales shared under the stars. Each retelling honored her quiet authority and the lessons embedded in her actions. Adults recounted how she had brought a reckoning without confrontation. Children marveled at how her silent gaze had revealed truth where no one else could see it, and families embraced the subtle shifts in understanding she had fostered. Ayana's legend was not built on fear, nor on might, nor on the weight of her voice. It was built on perception, patience, and the unwavering courage to act in accordance with what was right, even when invisible to the world. People began to internalize her teachings. A father, who had once dominated his household with harsh words, learned to listen more attentively to his children. Mothers, previously marginalized, realized that their quiet contributions held immense power when observed carefully. Merchants who had cheated or acted unfairly adjusted their practices, not because they feared punishment, but because they recognized the presence of accountability, a quiet force that watched, assessed, and ensured truth. Villagers no longer relied solely on loud declarations to assert morality or influence. The silent wisdom Ayana embodied became a new standard, guiding behavior without overt coercion. Seasons passed, and Ayana's legend grew beyond the borders of the village. Travelers and distant neighbors came to witness the remarkable woman who had transformed an entire community without speaking a word. They observed how the villagers conducted themselves, thoughtful, reflective, and attentive. They listened as elders recounted how a single quiet presence had altered generations, teaching respect, honesty, and the subtle art of influence. Tales spread like a gentle wind, carrying the message that silence, far from being weakness, could be the most profound form of communication. In time, children who had grown up under her guidance became leaders themselves, embodying her lessons in observation, patience, and subtle authority. They learned that power need not shout to be felt and that the absence of words could carry more weight than 1,000 speeches. The village flourished, not through domination or fear, but through the quiet strength of those who saw, understood, and acted. Ayana's presence became a cornerstone of their culture, a living example of how courage, wisdom, and integrity could manifest without a single utterance. Ayana herself remained unchanged. She did not seek recognition, nor did she crave accolades. Her satisfaction came from the transformation she had fostered, from seeing justice and understanding blossom where ignorance and fear had once reigned. She walked among the village not as a ruler or enforcer, but as a witness and guide. Every smile of understanding, every thoughtful action, every spark of courage in the hearts of the villagers reminded her that her silent work had been more powerful than words could ever hope to achieve. By the time she reached her later years, the village was irrevocably altered. Lessons of silent observation, reflection, and quiet courage had taken root. The story of Ayana, the woman who spoke without words, was told to every child at bedtime, recounted in every market, and honored in every council meeting. Her message was simple yet profound: words are not the only way to be heard. Silence can reveal the deepest truths. Her legacy endured for generations. Even as time passed and new leaders rose, the villagers never forgot the quiet girl whose gaze, actions, and unwavering presence reshaped their world. Ayana had proven that influence does not always need a voice. Power does not always demand noise. Courage does not always announce itself. And truth, when held with patience, observation and wisdom, can ripple outward silently, transforming hearts, minds and entire communities. Her silence had spoken louder than words ever could, and it had changed everything.